Welcome to the New Rules for Negotiating 10-Minute Learning Series, a short but comprehensive series of contract negotiation webinars specifically designed for people who negotiate complex customer-supplier agreements. This year's lessons are based on my training manual, The Contract Professional's Playbook. This session is transitioning complex scopes of work to the supplier. And it's Seafair weekend here in August 2018 in Seattle, and you do hear the blue angels flying overhead. My ex-husband used to say that they fly close enough he could tell whether or not the pilots have shaved. He's not that far off. We can actually see like all kinds of details about the planes as they come over. So let's get started. There is an obvious need to work collaboratively to launch a complex project. If there is considerable work to be done by the supplier, which then needs to be transitioned at some point to another supplier or back to the customer at completion, the contract should include a formal process to manage those transition phases, initiation, mid-project, and completion. Now, guys, this is different than milestones for acceptance criteria and payment. I'm not talking about establishing milestones and payment criteria or acceptance criteria for a milestone for IT phasing. I'm talking about an actual plan around transitioning work. So when something is completed, what does the transition look like back to the customer or to another third-party supplier? And so I'm literally talking about transitions of work that's been accepted, quote unquote, as complete, i.e. meeting the scope criteria. So the goal is to transition the work to maintain the customer's business during the handoff of the work to the supplier at initiation, or from one supplier to another supplier at a mid-phase, or back to a customer at the end of a phase or at the end of a contract and the initiation of a contract with another supplier. The goal is to maintain the customer's business. So if some of you are wondering, like, why is transition planning part of a contract professional's learning track? Why is it included in the contract professional's playbook? That's a really legitimate and valid question because most people don't really pay attention to this. Transition planning is part of governance and ought to be included in the contract, meaning there should be a schedule around what the transition phases look like, what those roles and responsibilities look like, because it is about risk identification. Your role as a contract professional in these highly strategic relationships is to help those in your organization and any internal or external subject matter experts. And the purpose of this checklist and this three-step process I'm going to talk about is to identify the series of known risk events and ensure that the contract provisions adequately address those known risk events. Meaning, we know with transitions that there are certain risks that will occur if left unaddressed, and then our job is to address them in the contract language. So the best practice for transitioning the work would be to include a governance provision in the contract. And an even bestest practice would be to document the transition plan at the time of the solicitation or RFP and include it then in the contract, meaning give the supplier a heads up of what a potential transition plan would look like and include it in the solicitation, allow the supplier to be able to bid and apply resources to that plan, and then include the provision in the contract. There are 3 steps to developing the transition plan. So the first step is to develop the plan. Duh. Okay. So too often, though, project managers at the customer's companies, organizations will rely on the supplier's project schedule. as a transition plan, but it's not, because suppliers don't really know or have any insight into a customer's decision-making process. So suppliers don't know what needs to be done by the customer personnel to transition the project at initiation, mid-phase, or at the completion of the project, or at the end or termination of the contract, meaning it's time to get a new supplier on, or the project has just come to its natural end. Those are things that the customer has to understand and attempt to identify. Use the transition plan checklist provided with this video to help you. So I'm not going to go through all the bullets and consider this or consider that. The transition plan is self-explanatory with instructions. There are highlights in blue font to kind of give you a little bit of my thinking. It is not the end-all be-all. The checklist is the starting point for your stakeholder conversations. It's the thought process. Even if your organization is hesitant to include it in a solicitation or in the contract, it's never too late to use that plan to create a document, even if it's just an internal email or an addendum. Okay, the second step is to develop a process to maintain continuity of resources at the time of negotiating the contract. So this is after you've awarded the work to the supplier and you're in the process of finalizing the terms and conditions. You want to mutually identify a limited number of personnel who are designated as key personnel for both parties. Now, customers love to ask it of suppliers, and then suppliers say, well, we need to know who to work with. And increasingly, customers that I work with are more comfortable than ever before to designate some personnel besides, an administrative contact for payment purposes. Now, these people's names don't have to be in the contract. What we want are some titles that would be included in a key personnel clause, meaning these are the people who will be working together to implement and manage the transition plan. Key personnel clauses are tricky. I've negotiated them, especially when I start getting into multi-year agreements. I've even negotiated key personnel clauses with an incentive bonus for every year that we're able to keep some of the more sophisticated personnel leadership on the account. So I'm seeing a real change in some engineering firms where there's a boomer generation with a lot of knowledge and a millennial generation with technical knowledge and degrees, but not enough knowledge within the customer. Those are clients that typically want an incentive for key personnel for a particular duration of one of these projects. So consider an incentive if you can. Third, you develop an effective communication plan. This is where my clients trip. If I can get my clients to do a transition plan, that's phenomenal. If we can get some key personnel in a clause, that's even more phenomenal. If we can't get an effective communication plan, then our efforts are shot. A communication and change management process is critical during transitions. Customer stakeholders may legitimately be unreceptive to the changes that happen during transitions, right? And so if a stakeholder doesn't understand why the change is happening or what the transition phase looks like or the duration of it, they could legitimately derail or delay the project, and we certainly don't want that to happen. So part of the plan, the entire transition plan, is an effective communication campaign. That is not usually part of the contract. So like some of the phasing and acceptable criteria of the plan, timing might even be included like as a spreadsheet or something. We do get key personnel clauses, but the development of the communication campaign is usually held by someone else in the organization who does communication, or is done by the contract manager as an email. But as part of my teachings, when I am done with my contract part, I make sure that there's someone assigned to that part of the process. Those clients who have developed effective communication campaigns to alert stakeholders about pending transitions have had much more successful transitions, particularly in outsourcing, where we are phasing out certain types of work or are phasing in a new supplier for certain types of work. Okay, if you'd like to learn more, please email me at jan@jneiden.com. I'd love to share the playbook with you and let me know if you've got questions, comments, or concerns.